I have a little robin that comes for his breakfast to my garden every day, and the minute I picked out the yarn for this blanket, I knew that I had to name it Robin. It is a super simple 8-row repeat, nice and repetitive, but you get so much texture from just those 8 rows. It never ceases to amaze me how 2 little stitches used in different ways can produce so many amazing different patterns. Robin is a blanket that is designed for those of you who are experienced knitters and want something really nice and simple and easy to knit so that you don't have to concentrate too much. But it is also really good for those of you who are beginners, who have mastered a knit and a purl stitch and want to move on to a bigger project but don't really feel ready to tackle something that has lots of complicated stitch patterns. Just using knit and purl stitches can still create the most wonderful piece of knitting. To knit a blanket the same size as my sample blanket here, which is 60 centimeters wide by about 80 centimeters long, you are going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. For those of you outside the UK, that is light worsted weight or 3-weight yarn. And if you're looking for a meterage in terms of how much yarn you need, you're probably looking at between 1,000 and 1,200 meters of yarn. Your average 100-gram ball of double knit yarn has about 300 meters of yarn. You are also going to need a set of circular knitting needles. You will have too many stitches to work on straight needles, so you do want to use circular needles with a cable that is about 120 centimeters long so that you've got enough length to accommodate the entire width of this blanket. You are also going to need some embroidery scissors and a tapestry needle so that you can sort out those ends when you change yarn ball. And then last but not least, you are going to need 2 stitch markers, and we use these to mark our side borders and separate them from the main textured panel, which just makes knitting the blanket so much easier. With my blanket patterns, I like to separate out the number of stitches that you cast on for your side borders from the middle textured panel. That just gives you the flexibility to use a different sized border or even a different stitch pattern for your border, and then still know how many stitches you need to cast on for that middle textured pattern. The pattern multiple for Robin for the middle textured panel is 10 plus 4, so you want to cast on in multiples of 10 and then add 4 additional stitches. Once you've done that, for your side border you will need to cast on an additional 18 stitches, and that is 9 stitches for either side. So for my blanket that is about 60 centimeters wide, I cast on a total of 132 stitches, and that includes your stitches for the side border. I'm going to cast on a very small sample today, and for all my blankets my preferred cast on method is the long tail cast on. I have a separate tutorial for that if you need to take a look at it, but if you have a cast on method that you prefer personally to use, then you can cast on using that method. Your blanket will still work in the same way. This blanket is knitted from the bottom up, so the first part of the blanket that we need to tackle is our bottom garter stitch border. That is a total of 15 rows, and they are all worked in exactly the same way. So I'm going to show you how to knit the first row, and then I will leave you to carry on and knit the remaining 14 rows of your border. The final stitch of every row is a selvage stitch, so every stitch in your border is worked in exactly the same way with the exception of this very last stitch. And by working that very last stitch in a slightly different way, you get a really lovely neat side edge all the way up the long edge of your blanket. So you want to just knit your way across the row, knitting every stitch except that final stitch. Instead of knitting this very last stitch, we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. So the first part of the process of working the stitch is to get the yarn to the front of your work. As a continental knitter, I just lift the yarn onto my right hand needle, but if you want to lift it physically to the front of your work, then that's fine too. Next, you want to pop your right hand needle into the stitch from right to left, so as if you were going to purl. What you don't want to do is go in from left to right, because you'll twist the stitch, and we don't want to do that at this stage. So pop your right hand needle in to the stitch from right to left. When it's firmly on the right hand needle, you can take your left hand needle out. And if, like me, you've just lifted your working yarn with that right hand needle, you want to lift it all the way back so that it is very firmly at the front of your work, so that you don't accidentally create an extra stitch. So that was row 1 of 15, and you now need to go away and knit an additional 14 rows, and then we will be ready to move on to the middle textured section that forms the bulk of our blanket. After your 15th row, you should have the smooth side of your cast on facing you as you're about to start the next row, and you should be able to count 8 ridges of garter stitch, and that forms your bottom garter stitch border. Next, we're ready to jump into the 8-row repeat, and the first time we work row 1, we're going to do a little bit of setup work just to pop our stitch markers in, but every subsequent time you work row 1 from then onwards, you're just going to slip the markers instead of placing them. To start row 1, you want to knit 9 stitches. Then you want to grab the first of your 2 stitch markers and just pop it onto your right hand needle. And then you want to knit your way across your row until you have 9 stitches left to work on your left hand needle, so 9 stitches before the end of the row. Just like we did at the other end of our row, when you have 9 stitches left to work, you're going to grab the second of your 2 stitch markers and pop it onto your right hand needle. Next, you want to knit the next 8 stitches. The final stitch of your row is again a selvage stitch, and you want to work it in the same way that you did when you were working your border, so you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. And that completes row 1. Your even numbered rows in this project form the wrong side of your work, so when you are working your even numbered rows, you should have the wrong side of your work facing you. To start row 2, you want to knit the 9 stitches before your stitch marker, so after the 9th stitch you should hit your stitch marker. When you hit your stitch marker, you are just going to slip it over from your left hand needle to your right hand needle, and then you want to purl the next 4 stitches. After those 4 stitches, we are going to jump into a 10 stitch repeat that we are going to repeat across until we hit this second marker over here. So you are going to start by knitting 6 stitches. And then you are going to purl 4 stitches. And once you've purled those 4 stitches, you're going to go back to the beginning of that 10 stitch repeat and start again by knitting 6. And after those 6 knit stitches, you are going to purl 4 stitches. And you're going to repeat those 10 stitches up until your second marker, and if you have counted your stitches correctly, you should hit your second marker after the purl 4 stitches. So your last 4 stitches should be purl stitches, and then you should hit your marker. When you reach that marker, you are going to slip it over from your left hand needle to your right hand needle, and then you want to carry on and knit 8 stitches. That should leave you with just 1 stitch left to work, and that stitch you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 3, and actually all our odd numbered rows, are right side rows, so they are when you have the right side of your work facing you as you're working. So as your blanket grows, you will have the texture facing you when you are knitting your odd numbered rows. Now row 3 is a really nice and easy row, as are all our odd numbered rows in this project. You just want to knit every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch of the row. You want to make sure that when you get to your stitch markers that you slip them from your left hand needle to your right hand needle, and that you don't accidentally lose them off your work. And then when we get to the end of the row, that final stitch is our selvage stitch, and you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. To start row 4, you want to knit the first 9 stitches, and that should take you to your first stitch marker. Once you hit that stitch marker, make sure to slip it from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to purl the next 4 stitches. Now, just like with row 2, you are going to jump into a 10 stitch repeat from here on in until you hit your second stitch marker, and that 10 stitch repeat goes as follows. You are going to knit 6 stitches, and then after knitting those 6 stitches you are going to purl 4 stitches. Then you're going to jump back to the beginning of that 10 stitch repeat and knit 6 stitches. And after those 6 you are going to purl 4 stitches, and those are the 10 stitches that you repeat until you hit your second marker, and if you've counted your stitches correctly that should come after a purl 4. Slip the second marker over and then knit 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 5 is another nice and easy one. Just like with our other odd numbered rows, you are going to knit your way across. You want to make sure that you slip those stitch markers over as you hit them, and then for that very final stitch of the row, instead of knitting it, you want to carry on like we have been doing for every row and slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 6, like with every other row, starts by knitting the first 9 stitches. Slip that first marker over from your left to your right needle, and then you want to knit the next 5 stitches. After knitting those 5 stitches, you want to purl the next 4 stitches. And now we want to work a 10 stitch repeat until you get to 5 stitches before this second marker. And those 10 stitches are as follows. You are going to knit 6 and then purl 4. So it's the same 10 stitch repeat that we had on rows 2 and 4, but with a slight change at the beginning and the end of the row. So it is knit 6 and then purl 4. And you work that all the way across until 5 stitches before your second marker, and if you've worked your stitches correctly that should come after a purl 4. These last 5 stitches here before the stitch marker you just want to go ahead and knit. Slip the second marker over and then knit 8 stitches. Finish the row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. For row 7, you want to just work your way across and knit everything except the final stitch. When you get to your stitch markers, you want to make sure that you slip them over rather than letting them drop off your needles. And then the final stitch of the row, instead of knitting it, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front to maintain that really lovely selvage edge that we're getting up the long sides of our blanket. Row 8 is the very last row in our pattern repeat, and you want to start that row by knitting the 9 stitches before your stitch marker. Slip that marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to knit the next 5 stitches. After knitting those 5 stitches, you want to purl the next 4 stitches. And then just like with row 6, you're going to jump into a 10 stitch repeat that you are going to work all the way across until 5 stitches before this second stitch marker. And that 10 stitch repeat goes as follows. You are going to knit 6 stitches. and after knitting 6 stitches you are going to purl 4 stitches. And you want to work that repeat until 5 stitches before the second marker, and you should hit 5 stitches before the second marker after a purl 4. So there we go, just 5 stitches left to work before we hit this second marker, and those 5 stitches you want to knit. Slip the second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So these 8 rows form the building blocks of your blanket, and what you would now do is go back to row 1 and work those 8 rows again, and then do the same thing for as many times as you need to get your blanket to about 5 centimeters shorter than you want your final overall length to be. Then what you want to do is to work rows 1 to 4 once more. So in the case of my blanket that I showed you at the beginning, I worked rows 1 to 8 a total of 31 times, and you can count your repeats by counting this little block of 2 garter stitch rows that form the end of your 8 row repeat. So I worked mine a total of 31 times, and then I went ahead and worked rows 1 to 4 once more, and at that point we would stop and start our top garter stitch border. So if you want to go ahead and do that and then come back, and I will show you how we work the top garter stitch border and finish everything off. Your project will obviously be a lot bigger than mine, but this sample gives you the general gist of what you should be looking at. You should have a stockinette corner in the very bottom corner of your project. You should have then a multiple number of the repeats of the 8 rows, and then you will have worked rows 1 to 4 once more, and you should be just about to start a right side row. We are now going to work a total of 16 rows in exactly the same way, and that will form our top garter stitch edging. Just like we did with the bottom garter stitch border, these rows are very simple to work. So you are going to knit your way all the way across until you have 1 stitch left on your left hand needle to work. As you work this first row of edging, you can actually get rid of your stitch markers. You don't need to keep them on your work anymore. So as you come across them, you can just flick them off your left hand needle and they will drop off, and you don't need those anymore. So you want to knit your way across until you have just 1 stitch left to work. As it has been through the whole project, this very last stitch of the row is our selvage stitch, and we are going to treat it in exactly the same way that we have treated every single final stitch of every single row in this project. So just like before, you should be really familiar with it now. You're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front, and always just make sure that you do lift your working yarn to the front of your work, because if you don't, you can end up creating a new stitch and your project will get bigger and bigger every row. So you want to work another 15 rows just like that until you've worked a total of 16. At that point you should count 8 garter ridges of edging that will be the same as your 8 garter ridges of edging at the bottom, and you should be just about to start a right side row. So the very final cast off row will be a right side row. So if you go away and work your 15 rows in addition to the one that I've shown you, and then we can come back and I'll show you how to get this project off your needles and into a finished blanket. The very last row of any blanket is the cast off, and for my blankets I like to keep it nice and simple and use a basic knitted cast off. Now if you've never worked a knitted cast off before, I do have a separate video that goes over it in really nice slow beginner friendly steps, but for the purpose of this video I'm just going to show you the first few stitches and then leave you to carry on with the rest of the row. You want to start your cast off by knitting the first 2 stitches. Try not to knit them too tight because you want your stitches to be fairly nice and relaxed so that you don't get a top edge that kind of pulls in and doesn't lay flat. Once you've knitted those 2 stitches, you're going to get your left hand needle, pop it into the first stitch that you knitted from left through to right, and then lift the stitch up, over and off the right hand needle so that it's gone over the second of the 2 stitches that you knitted, and you'll have gone from 2 stitches on your right hand needle back down to 1. Then the next step is to knit 1 more stitch so that you go back up to 2 stitches, and then you repeat that process of lifting the first stitch up and over the second stitch and off the right hand needle. And that is the process that you repeat all the way along your row. The golden rule is that you should never have more than 2 stitches on this right hand needle. If you do, then you've knitted one too many and you need to backtrack. And you want to repeat that all the way along until you have no stitches left to work on your left hand needle and just 1 stitch left to work on your right hand needle. And at that point we're ready to break our yarn and finish everything off. When you're down to this very last stitch on your right hand needle, you can break your yarn. You want to make sure that you leave a nice long tail so that you have enough yarn to securely sew in your ends. And then one final step that I like to do just to secure this final stitch is to loop the tail through the stitch. And the way I do that is I pull up to make the stitch bigger, and I can get rid of my needles, we don't need those anymore. And then I put my finger and thumb through that loop, grab the tail and pull it through, and then just pull and tighten it all up, and that means I have a nice secure foundation that I can then go in and sew in this tail. A couple of final bits and bobs just to finish off. I often get asked if a blanket pattern is reversible, and in the case of Robin, no, this pattern is not reversible. It's really tough to make a reversible blanket when you are incorporating something like stockinette stitch, and I prefer to have the freedom to create something that looks really good on the front of the blanket, doesn't look ugly on the back of the blanket, but it is just not reversible. So if you see here, this is the right side, we have a really defined stitch pattern, and if I show you the back, you can see that it's not messy, it's not ugly, it is just really plain and is mainly reverse stockinette stitch with a couple of little bits of texture that you can see because of the work we're doing on the front. For me, it's really a non-issue that this is the side of the blanket that most people are going to see, and I really don't mind the fact that it's not reversible. If you are somebody that prefers to have written instructions to follow along to, then I do have a free written pattern on my blog, and I also have available an ad-free PDF that you can buy if you want to have something that you can print off and take away with you rather than looking at a screen all the time. And finally, please feel free to knit this pattern in whatever weight yarn you like. It will work. Just make sure that you will need to adjust your stitch count depending on whether or not you are using thinner or thicker yarn, and you will also need to adjust the amount of times that you repeat the rows, again accommodating the size of yarn that you are using. I'll leave you with another blanket that you might like too, but that's all from me for today.